Hopefully. So yes, it's evening for me, but I want to begin by saying good morning and Kalimera and Jen Dobry to everybody. Hello from Australia. I just want to acknowledge the fact that where I am in my home, I am on the grounds of the Gadigal and Wangal people, the traditional owners, the First Nation owners of this part of Australia. And what it feels like it's been a very long time since I've seen the Mediterranean in Europe, so I'm very jealous of you all, and not quite sure when we will see you again in the flesh. But one of the things that I would like to do with this presentation is to contextualize the theatre of Nea Paphos, of which you've heard a little bit about today in the two previous talks in relationship to Fabrica Hill. But to look more broadly at the question of transition and whether we can see in the Hellenistic and Roman period, theatre architecture and theatrical performance more generally as a means of seeing broader transitions culturally, socially, politically, and economically. The work that I'm talking about today, of course, has grown out of the, grown out of the ongoing work of the Paphos Theatre archaeological project, inaugurated by Richard Green, who you'll see with myself in the centre between myself and Dr. Sminar Gabrielli in 1995. Our team is from the University of Sydney. We work under the auspices of the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus, and I would like to publicly acknowledge all of the support that we've received over these years, and also to acknowledge the support of the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens and my home institute, which is the Chowchak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. In terms of theatre on the island of Cyprus, what is interesting is if we begin to compare the various theatres across the island, can we see some interesting observations about chronological development and about architectural development? And there are 4 known theatres. I'm also going to refer to some other venues for performance and for spectacle as well that we know of archaeologically. There is, of course, the theatre at Nea Paphos, which is what I will be primarily speaking about today. The theatre at Kourion, the theatre at Salamis, the theatre at Soloi, and I will mention in passing the theatre at Kition, of which we know through a handful of epigraphic inscriptions suggesting a structure of Flavian date. And what's also interesting is there are a number of early European traveller accounts that refer to a theatre site, but it's worthwhile stressing that this location has never been marked archaeologically, so we do not know for certain if that theatre did exist. On top of that, I also want to mention the Paphos odeion, today also in Nea Paphos, and the 2 as yet unexcavated amphitheatres, the one at Salamis and the one at Nea Paphos as well. So we've got quite an interesting spread architecturally of these theatres. And what's also interesting is that they may well give us some indication in terms of urban layout and relationship between urban centres, population density, and the way that theatre was being used by a Ptolemaic and Roman audience on the island. As I said before, we've been excavating at the site of the theatre at Paphos since 1995, and one of the interesting things that our project has aimed to do is to not just understand the chronological development of the use of that particular building, but to also contextualise it within the broader urban infrastructure of the Hellenistic and Roman city. And so one of the things that we've been doing during the excavations, and you'll see it here in this orthographic image down the very bottom of it, is uncovering a significant 2nd century AD Roman road, paved road, which we believe leads to the ancient city gates. And again, part of that sacred passageway, processional way across to Paphos that I just mentioned before. And related to that is a number of other infrastructure items as well too, including an nymphaeum. So the theatre was not in isolation in any of these contexts. And also interestingly is understanding how the architectural development of all of these theatres have reflected contemporary changes in taste and in style. And I will refer to the fact that we have fragmentary, very, very fragmentary, but quite a significant number of imported marble items adorning the Roman phases of the theatre at Paphos, which again is indicative of the way that Cyprus was engaged with large-scale trade of building material in the 2nd century AD as well. Now, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that although you'll hear me argue today, as we've done in print, that the theatre at Paphos is the earliest on the island as a permanent building, there is quite considerable evidence of 4th century BC, 4th century BC theatrical activity on the island as well. Richard Green has published a large number of these terracottas in a number of publications over the years, showing a theatrical tradition on the island, such as this terracotta figurine, a little bit later admittedly, but of an actor found in Soloi, and a whole range of pieces as well. And he has argued very convincingly, I would suggest, that Cyprus has the terracottas found in Cyprus show a clear link with Athenian traditions of new comedy of that period in time. It's quite likely that there was a temporary stage structure or some degree of temporary building built somewhere on the island for use. What is quite clear is that before the construction of the very first permanent theatre, and we will argue in around about 300 BC, that there is at least acknowledgement and understanding of a theatrical tradition on the island. We know this not just from the terracottas, but also, of course, from surviving accounts of Alexander the Great's dramatic performance or festival that he put on for his troops following the siege of Tyre, in which the main actors, the large named actors of the era, were brought in to perform for his successful troops in a very similar manner to the way that US armed forces throughout most of the 20th century used singers and stars and movie stars and so on as well. And what's interesting is that we're told that this performance was financed by the kings of Cyprus, which again is indicative of the fact that there is at least an understanding of theatrical tradition long before a permanent building. This is fitting into a much larger discussion scholarly over the last decade or so in terms of the spread of theatre outside of Attica in the 4th century AD. I refer to particularly the work of the late Catherine Boscia and her studies of theatres of Sicily, but this is again just part of a much larger network of understanding of theatre buildings, and there's been a number of conferences, including one here in Sydney in 2013. It's also from a Cypriot perspective, and I bow here to John's mention before about the incredibly nuanced understanding of the cultural koinai of the late classical, early Hellenistic period on the island of Cyprus. But one of the key things we need to think about in terms of any concept of transformation and transition on the island is that theatre itself is a very foreign concept being imported onto the island at this point in time. And it's a clear indication of the fact that both before and after the Ptolemaic seizure of the island, that there is a growing awareness and a growing willingness to be part of this Hellenic world. Theatre is one way of representing this. I just throw up these stamps from the 1960s to show that that theatrical tradition, once it took place, or once it took hold on the island, would continue for some time. So as I said before, we have archaeological knowledge of 4 theatres, and certainly the suggestion that there was one at Kourion as well. In terms of the history of the excavations of these sites, of course, where we're working in Paphos, the Department of Antiquities did some preliminary work in the 1960s, one season of excavation by the University of Trier in the 1980s, and our ongoing work since 1995. The theatre at Kourion, excavated both before and after the Second World War by the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and published relatively extensively by Stilwell in 1961. Salamis Theatre, of course, excavated by the Department of Antiquities under the direction of Vassos Kariolgis in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and I have an image on my next slide of those excavations. The Soloi Theatre in the late 1920s as part of the Swedish Cyprus expedition, and the Odeon of Paphos, likewise in the late 1960s by the Department of Antiquities. As I previously mentioned, both of the amphitheatres that we are aware of have never been excavated. What's interesting is that all of these structures, apart from the amphitheatres and apart from the Theatre of Paphos, were restored by the department in the 1960s and 1970s. And what's also interesting is that none of them have been published properly, and I will include the Paphos Theatre in this as well, although we are working towards it, you will be pleased to know. So much of what we're talking about today architecturally is conjectural, and I definitely would suggest that there's a need for a reappraisal of all of these structures in a much greater and more nuanced understanding. Here we go from Vassos's memoirs of the excavations at Salamis, of excavation and restoration of the theatre at Salamis. Now, what's interesting, if we talk about the location of each of these structures, they are, of course, within urban centres, and they are all coastal. The theatre at Paphos, as we have already mentioned or heard mentioned this morning, is located on the southern slope of Fabrica Hill. And what's quite significant too is its location within the broader town plan of Nea Paphos. One of the clear indications that we have of the very early dating of this theatre is the fact that it's actually facing on a south by southwest direction. That is, it's facing towards the harbour of Paphos. Not unsurprising, although rather interestingly not ideal for the surviving topography of that part of Fabrica Hill. But what is interesting is it means that the theatre is out of alignment with the rest of the north-south, east-west grid plan that we see in that part of theatre, as so prominently first identified by Jolanta, and of course has been clarified by ongoing excavations by both the Department of Antiquities and by the various Polish missions as well over the years. So to me, this suggests that the theatre predates any attempt at town planning, at least in that part of Paphos. But it is prominently located in an area between Fabrica and the road leading to Ballia Paphos. Likewise, the theatre at Kourion, as we know, for anyone who's visited, is spectacular with its view over the sea on the very eastern edge of the Acropolis. And again, taking advantage of the natural bedrock to create the theatre. Worthwhile bearing in mind that one of the similarities of all of the four theatres of Cyprus is the use of local limestone, that you don't get the addition of other architectural elements, and that is particularly marble, until the Roman period, until the 2nd century AD, that they are, with the notable exception of Salamis, as we'll see in a moment, all being built in the more traditional Greek manner, which is to take advantage of a natural slope where possible. In terms of Salamis, again, its central location within key public architecture of the urban phase. And remember, as you'll see in a moment, that the theatre at Salamis is a little bit more recent than both of those at Paphos and at Kourion, but you'll see it's very located to the very closely located to both the gymnasium and baths, and positioned between it and the theatre is the location, or the likely location, of the amphitheatre. And what's significant is that, unlike the other three theatres, Salamis is the only theatre facing inland. Although it's coastal, it's not facing towards the sea, it's facing away, which again is a clear indication of it being a Roman construction as opposed to a Hellenistic one, as you'll see from aerial images such as this. And then finally, the theatre at Soloi, again, although it's a later Roman construction, is one which is built in a more traditional Greek manner, that is taking advantage of the slope and facing over towards the location of the agora, the basilica, and the remnants of the city walls as they have been identified historically. So we have two theatres that are built during the Hellenistic period, two that are built during the Roman period, three of the four are of the more traditional Greek manner, all of them during their later Roman phases fit within the pattern of what we call the imperial Eastern tradition of theatre architecture. Basically, a rough breakdown is that the Paphos Theatre has the longest lifespan as a space being used for performance, constructed in the very late 4th or early 3rd centuries BC and destroyed in the middle of the 4th century AD by earthquake. Kourion, constructed early 2nd century BC and again destroyed by earthquake. Salamis, constructed at some point in the 1st century AD, undergoing damage in those 4th century earthquakes, but continuing seemingly to be used as late as the 6th century. Soloi being constructed in the very late 2nd century AD, and its lifespan, it's difficult to determine what has been published to date, and the odeion at Paphos constructed in either the very late or early 2nd century AD. Both the amphitheatre at Salamis and Nea Paphos, again, we have very limited information, but epigraphic evidence suggests that the Salamis Amphitheatre was constructed in the Flavian period. Let's have a look at each of these in a little more detail. And again, the chronological breakdown, as we've been able to determine in the case of the theatre at Paphos during excavations, falls into a basic breakdown of around about 6 or so phases. It's an initial Hellenistic construction, an Alexandrian phase, Augustan rebuilding, again fitting in with patterns that we've heard Claire discuss this morning. Interestingly, no clear evidence of a Flavian rebuild at Paphos, but I suspect that there probably was one. Certainly, most of the archaeological evidence and architectural evidence surviving at the site dates from the Antonine phase. We have suggestions of some Severan remodelling of the theatre, and then an aquatic phase built at the very final use of the theatre before its final destruction. And again, if we take a quick skim through a reconstruction of the Paphos Theatre as it would have looked under the Antonine emperors in the middle of the 2nd century AD. The absolute earliest evidence that we have for dating the theatre, and remember that theatres are notoriously difficult to date, particularly earlier phases that have been obliterated by later Roman construction, but our best evidence is the epigraphic shapes of a series of lettering carved into some of the upper seatings of the cavea, which are clearly late 4th century BC in style. And we have published these in the past along with other evidence for this early construction date. But it's worthwhile bearing in mind that we have no idea of the original shape of the theatre. And there are some interesting features that have been revealed during excavations, including a series of bedrock cuts on both the western parados and on the eastern parados, but particularly visible on the western side, which appears to be quarrying activities which predates the construction of the theatre, and indeed may have even supplied stone for the construction of the theatre. So the assumption was that the theatre was relatively small in its original phase and has grown and expanded. We certainly know it's expanded under the Alexandrian period, and again, a whole series of architectural features associated with the very first permanent stage building at Paphos. And again, you'll see parallels with material that Jolanta just showed us on top of Fabrica as well. We even have some degree of consistency in terms of the dating with a published statue base. Unfortunately, the statue base itself has now been lost, but it was quite well published in the early 20th century. And we have references to a Dionysic guild of artists and actors, which is indicative of a thriving theatrical scene within Paphos by the middle of the 2nd century BC. It's also at this time that we have the construction of a Turonian tunnel through the center of the theatre at Paphos. It would be later filled in during the Augustan phase, but what is fascinating is that this is one of only 13 of such known features anywhere in the Mediterranean, which does indicate that Paphos was a theatre of some significance and renown even by this point in time. As I said before, most of what we know about the architecture of the theatre, or what has survived indeed, is actually of the Roman Antonine phase. I show you here some images of our virtual reality reconstruction to give you a sense of the size and scale of the theatre as it looked at this point in time. But we have considerable evidence, including an honorific inscription and quite clear evidence of the expansion of the cavea to allow for greater access and egress for spectators, and large retaining walls constructed to hold everything in place. During the very final phase, the aquatic phase, what is interesting, and again, building upon what Claire has just told us, this significant role of water supply to Nea Paphos also being used in terms of supplying water for the theatre. And we have evidence of both aquatic phases here in Paphos and also at Salamis. And I think one of the key ways to understanding theatre, Roman theatre on the island, is going to be understanding water supply. The cistern, the barrel vaulted cistern that Claire showed before, is interesting that according to our admittedly very rough calculations, would have had precisely the capacity to flood the orchestra of the theatre during the 3rd century AD. And we have clear evidence from the theatre itself, including spouted pipes, but significantly this containment wall separating the orchestra, which would be used for displays of aquatic animals and for performers dressed as water nymphs, and separating them from the audience, as we know from other containment walls and other contemporary theatres in Anatolia. If we move on to Kourion, what's interesting is that its construction date is at least a century after Paphos, but otherwise its phasing is relatively similar to Paphos as well, with an Augustan phase, again, probably associated with earthquake, remodeling and rebuilding, some work under Nero and under Trajan, and then a conversion of the theatre into an arena under the Severan emperors, particularly Caracalla. And we have a similar parallel. I don't have time today to talk about it, but we have a similar parallel in Paphos, we believe. So again, what is interesting is that the excavations by the Americans at the site have shown actually how little of the original theatre survived, which is difficult for us to perceive today when we see how heavily it's been restored. But nevertheless, through architectural reconstructions, we see a similar structure in the 2nd century AD to that at Paphos, and again, fitting in with the broader concept of Eastern types of theatres of the Roman Empire. The theatre at Salamis, however, is a little bit interesting. Again, I've already referred to how it's slightly different in terms of its location, in terms of its view, but it appears to have been constructed under the Augustan phase. There is possible expansion or remodeling under the Hadrianic phase, potentially as a result of the Jewish revolt, and then very little published or very little obvious signs of remodeling of that theatre until its conversion to an aquatic venue at around about the same time as the theatre at Paphos as well. So again, what's interesting is that both the lower seats of the cavea, which are using natural bedrock or built upon natural bedrock, and the outer phases, and here you see during the excavations images from the Illustrated London News at the time. But what is interesting is you'll see the significant vaulting and very, very heavy walls that are being used as support for the upper cavea. This is a traditional Roman theatre, one which is being built on flat ground. It is out of keeping with the other three. And again, the Soloi Theatre, again, we have very little chronological indication, but it appears to have been constructed during the Severan phase. And as for how long it was used and whether it was being remodeled, it's just incredibly difficult to determine with any degree of certainty. But if one looks at early photographs from the late 1920s and early 1930s, you get an indication of how it looked. And again, it even appeared in the stamp in 1935. Again, following its restoration in the early 1960s, you do get a sense of its size and scale, and again, it's taking advantage of the vistas. I did mention the odeion, and I don't want to go into too much detail beyond saying that it appears to be that it's of late 1st century or early 2nd century AD date. And again, a venue for more intimate performances, for lyrical poetry or for musical productions. Of course, its location closer to the Asclepion also suggests that it also had a ritual function. But again, you'll see it's very self-contained, semicircular, and again, built within a sloping hill. So again, fitting more broadly within a Greek theatrical tradition, like its larger theatre. Both the amphitheatres of Salamis and Nea Paphos, as I mentioned before, have never been excavated, but both of them are very similar in size, around about 100 metres long, and a depression in Paphos, which is approximately 80 metres wide. The one at Paphos is very close to the harbour. It is interesting that Wright estimated that both would have had a seating capacity of around about 20,000.
2 minutes left.
Thank you, Dimitri. Very close. So just if we compare them quickly, we see, and I want to put the caveat of the warning that we have, all sorts of implications about using estimates of seating, but Paphos Theatre, an estimate of around about 8,000 spectators at its maximum extent under the Antonine period. Kourion Theatre, under its maximum extent, around about 4,500 audience members. Salamis, about 15,000, but I personally take that figure with a large grain of salt. And Soloi Theatre, a little over 3,000 people. These are sizable indications of population, and what is interesting is, of course, it is both Paphos and Salamis, the larger urban centres, that have the larger theatres to accommodate the number of people. Likewise, a comparison of the dimensions of each of the four theatres is interesting. Salamis is effectively double the size of Soloi, as it is indeed the number of rows, and so we get some really interesting parallels backwards and forwards. Our architect, Jeff Stennett, created this very interesting comparison chart for our team, but I think it's worthwhile sharing because you do get a really interesting sense of just how similar and yet also how different each of the four structures are. So in conclusion, what I just want to point out is a couple of interesting things that might give us time to pause and think about transitions. Cypriot theatres, with the exception of Salamis, were basically Hellenistic in design and really only modified in Roman periods as a result of requirements, i.e. modification after earthquake. But when they were modified to suit practical demands. That is, they were keeping up with changing styles and natures of contemporary performances. The locations of all of them, unsurprisingly, are urban, but they all, again with the exception of Salamis, are taking advantage of natural views. Topography, again with the exception of Salamis, is important, but in all cases there was some adjustment to make the theatres a fit. Alexandrian influence is clearly visible in the theatres of Paphos and Kourion. This makes sense, they are the two Hellenistic theatres. Augustan influence is quite clearly visible, likewise at Nea Paphos and Kourion. All of the four theatres show high Roman theatres of Eastern types. We have importation of marble at all of them, again unsurprisingly from the 2nd century AD onwards. Both Kourion and Paphos appear to have been converted for arenas, but for how long, it's difficult to tell. We clearly see the importance of water for conversion for aquatic displays at both Paphos and Salamis in the 3rd century. All of them abandoned in the 4th century, and that has some really interesting socio-economic implications. One area of study, I don't have time to talk about it today, but one area of study that our team is looking at is the recycling of architectural elements from the theatre following abandonment. This is the PhD topic of one of our team members, Candice Richards, but it's really interesting, and I would like to, at some stage, see if there is similar recycling of material at the other theatres as well. And then finally, the amphitheatres themselves, too little information to tell at this point in time, but what is interesting is that Paphos has all three types of Roman entertainment venues in the one urban location. There is much to learn from the theatres of Cyprus still. Thank you.